Hi guys, in today's video I'm going to show you how to troubleshoot your IT mode HBA card if you're having some problems with it. So as you know, I have an eBay store called the Art of Server, and I sell a lot of pre-flashed IT mode HBA cards. And every now and then I get a customer who contacts me and says, hey, I bought the card and installed it and something's not working. And so today I'm going to go through some of the troubleshooting steps that I often recommend. And hopefully this helps you guys out, especially if you're not that familiar with this type of hardware, and whether you got it from my store or somewhere else and something's not working. I'm hoping that this video will provide some of the troubleshooting steps to help you kind of narrow down and identify where the problem is. Okay, so what I have here in front of me is my server. That's kind of my testbed server that I use for flashing the cards that you guys buy from me and various other things as well. Some of the benchmarking is also done on this server as well. And I've got it's a 16 bay, by the way, it's a 16 bay 3.5 inch backplane, and direct connect. So these are SATA cables that go to the SAS cable. This is a forward breakout cable, and there's 16 3.5 inch bays. And so I have 4 SFF 8087 cables, each going to 4 of those bays, and so I've got a total of 16 connections here. Okay, and I have 2 HBA cards here. They're both based on the LSI SAS 2008 chipset, but they're different cards. This is a Dell H310 that's been converted to a IT mode HBA, and this is an original LSI 9201-8i. And the reason why I'm showing you both of these cards today is just to kind of give you an idea that some of the things I'm going to show you apply across the board regardless of which particular model card you got. Okay, so the way I like to approach problems like this, well, first of all, let me just kind of give you an example of some of the problems I've heard customers relay to me. So for example, someone might say, hey, my hard drives are not showing up. Okay, something as simple as like that, right? Now, unfortunately, a statement like my hard drives are not showing up could mean a lot of different things, because there's a lot of different moving components in the technology here. And so if you're just trying to troubleshoot that at its face value, you can kind of go in all sorts of different directions and waste a lot of time. And so I like to look at the problem from a technology stack perspective. So you usually have the hardware, and even within the hardware you've got the motherboard, the HBA card, the cabling, the hard drive. Okay, and then on top of that you have your operating system, and on top of that you might have your file system technology, if you're using ZFS or if you're using some other file system. And then on top of that you might have applications and also kind of a user interface. So for example, in FreeNAS you usually have a web user interface, right? That's a graphical user interface. So when someone says, hey, my hard drives are not showing up, depending on what layer you're talking about, that could mean a lot of different things, right? And if you start troubleshooting from the top, you could end up with going down the wrong path, basically. And so I tend to start from the bottom up, meaning that I look at the most common denominator technology first, and that's usually at the bottom of the technology stack, and that kind of forms your foundation, right? And so as long as you're making sure your foundations are solid as you investigate where the problem is, then as you go up the technology stack and you realize, for example, that maybe what a person means by my hard drive is not showing up is that my Z pool is not showing up. And in that case, there could be a lot of different reasons. It could be that this HBA card is bad. It could be that the hard drive suddenly went bad. It could be the cable went bad. It could mean that the PCI slot went bad. Or it could simply mean that maybe there was some change in the ZFS version, and ZFS refused to import the Z pool, okay, for some reason. Okay, so there could be a lot of different reasons to conclude that, hey, my hard drives are not showing up. And so that's why I like to start from the bottom and go up, versus from going from the top going down. Just as you just saw in my example here, there could be a lot of different reasons why you could say, hey, my hard drives are not showing up. So anyway, so let's start at the very bottom, right? And I'm going to skip a couple of things because they're not directly relevant to this stuff, but you want to make sure, for example, that your motherboard is working. You want to make sure that you've got, you know, adequate power supplied to your system. Okay, and in the server chassis, most of the time that's not going to be a problem, but I know sometimes people use their old gaming computer or their old desktop computer as a, you know, to kind of build it as a NAS, and sometimes, you know, you might not have an adequate power supply, or perhaps there was adequate power, but then you upgraded the CPU or you added some component, or, you know, for whatever reason, you know, you want to make sure that there's adequate power to the system. When you have, you know, when you're just at the limit of your power supply, sometimes you can get very flaky symptoms that kind of come and go, and it's not exactly clear, and you're going to be kind of chasing your tail. So anyway, so some of those are the kind of foundational things that I'm not going to go too much into, but just, you know, keep that in mind if you know, might even suspect that there is some other thing going on. And then another thing that is a common problem that people don't realize, especially if you're kind of new to the server world or the workstation world, where you just acquired a dual socket motherboard for your build, and you're going only with one processor. So in this example, I have two sockets, but I only have one CPU in the server because I don't use this for a lot of compute intensive stuff. In some cases, especially in the more modern dual socket motherboards, the PCI lanes are tied to the CPU. So in this case, that's not the case because this is a Westmere generation motherboard, and so the PCI lanes are tied to these IOH chipsets here, and so that's not the case. All these PCI lanes work in this particular motherboard, but if you went with like a Sandy Bridge, Ivy Bridge, or newer, the PCI lanes are tied to the sockets, and so if you don't have a CPU, some of your PCI slots are going to be disabled. So, you know, is that the problem? For example, I've run into that. So make sure some of those foundational things are in place. Now, let's say you've cleared all those. You know your motherboard's working, you know the PCI slot's working, you know you've got adequate power, and you know your hard drive's not showing up. Okay, so what do? Absolute first thing you should do with any of the LSI HBA cards that I've ever seen is that you look for the heartbeat LED. Okay, so each of these cards, whether it's the SAS 2008 or 2308 or 3008 or even up to the 3408, they always have a heartbeat LED. And on the H310, for example, this is the Dell H310, the heartbeat LED is, I believe, over there. Okay, and then this is the LSI, the genuine LSI 9201-8i, and the heartbeat LED is over here. This one actually is kind of nice. LSI put a whole bunch of extra LEDs, so there's like 8 LEDs for each of the SAS lanes. There's these 2 large LEDs that flicker when there's activity on any of the ports, and then there's a heartbeat LED. So there's a lot of kind of diagnostic indicators that you can see on the genuine LSI card. That's kind of nice to have. The Dell doesn't really have that. All it has is the heartbeat LED, and although I've seen a few cards very rarely, and I don't know how or why it happened, but there's 2 spots for additional LEDs that are usually vacant. I've seen a few cards where the LED is actually there, and those are for activity LEDs, a little bit like these 2 here. So anyway, the absolute first thing you want to do is look at the card when you power it on and see if you have a heartbeat. So I'm going to go ahead and power this machine on and then show you what that looks like. Okay, so hopefully you can hear me over the noise of the fan here. You'll see right here on the Dell card that LED is now green and flashing, usually about 1 flash per second. So it's not a very fast flashing, but it's just kind of a steady 1 second. Every second it just flashes. And the same thing over here on the LSI card. You'll see that it flashes about once per second. So this is the heartbeat LED. And when the heartbeat LED is flashing, that's a good indicator that the card is working, because it means a couple of things. One, it means the card's getting power. Okay, so if your PCI slot wasn't active and you didn't get any power, those you wouldn't get any lights at all. Okay, and second, the firmware is actually running. So you could have a perfectly working card, but if there's no firmware on it, so a lot of times, for example, I have to erase the firmware in order to flash the IT mode firmware. Well, during the phase when the firmware is erased and it's not running, that heartbeat LED will not blink. Okay, so if you have a blinking LED, it tells you you've got power to the card, and it tells you that the firmware is running. All right, so once you have that, then that's a really good sign. And so the next steps is, okay, you probably want to troubleshoot, for example, the SAS cables to make sure that the SAS cables are working properly. Now, a tip about the SAS cables is that there's kind of a trick of the trade, so to speak, by kind of isolating, swapping parts around to isolate where the problem is. So it's a little bit like, if you worked on cars and you've got, like, say, a misfire on a cylinder, and you're not really sure if it's the spark plug or if it's the ignition coil that's with the coil on top of spark plug type of design. Well, what you can do is you swap the spark plugs and leave the ignition coil behind, right? And so if the problem follows the spark plug, then the spark plug was bad. But if the problem stayed in the original cylinder, then it's probably the ignition coil on that cylinder, right? So very similarly, you can troubleshoot the problems with a cable like that. So as an example, let's say that on this HBA, I have 8 connections, right? 2 SFF 8087 ports, and I've got 4 hard drives to each cable, right? But let's say I only have 7 hard drives showing up, and somehow something's missing, right? So first of all, you want to isolate which cable that is coming from. So, later on in the next segment, I want to show you how to look at which hard drives are connected and stuff like that. But so combine what I'm about to tell you now with that later piece. But let's say you unplug one of these cables. All right, and so if you were only showing originally showing 7 hard drives, and you unplug this cable, and now you're only seeing 4 hard drives, then that means this cable, who was supposed to carry 4 hard drive connections, it was actually only carrying 3. And so maybe there's a problem somewhere around here. We don't know yet, but at least you kind of know that it might have something to do with this cable. Okay, and if you unplug this one and you see 4 connections go away, then for sure you know that there's some problem going on either with this cable or this connector. All right, now how do you isolate that further? Well, if you know that this connector is carrying 4 hard drive connections and it seems to be working fine, well, plug it into this one. Okay, and now if you still see 4 hard drives showing up, and this one was working fine on the bottom slot, but now you put it on the top slot and it's still working fine, then you know that this connector is working just fine. So more than likely the problem is with the cable on this side, or somewhere downstream. Maybe the hard drive died, who knows, or the slot in the back plane had a problem, or maybe the other end is loose, it doesn't properly connected and is loosely connected, and you need to reseat the connection on the SATA end, like one of these things. So that's one way you can troubleshoot the cable problem, is to kind of isolate down where the problem is by taking a known good condition thing and moving it to another port, and seeing if the problem follows the cable or follows the port. Now let's say that I had 4 good connections on this cable in the bottom port, and then I move it to the top port, okay, and then I'm only seeing 3 hard drives, okay, just like I did on this connection. Well, then if the problem is sticking to this port and not the cable itself, then there might be a problem with the port on the card, right? So that way you can kind of isolate down, is it the cable, is it the port, which side is the problem. Okay, so let me put these back in. So that's one troubleshooting technique that I highly recommend when you're really, because there's so many different parts. There's the HBA, there's the cables, there's potentially a backplane, there's a hard drive. You really want to kind of narrow down your problem until you've kind of isolated down to one thing. And so one way to isolate that especially if you have a card with, you know, many ports. Like this is a 2-port one, and you know, it could be, the problem could be one of any of those 2 ports. But if you had like a 4-port card, you know, you want to repeat the same type of process, but maybe take a cable that's known to connect 4 hard drives, and then move that through each port to see if the hard drive drops out. And if it drops out on a particular port that you've previously had problems with, then maybe there's a problem with the port. But if you take that cable and you swap it into all 4 ports and your hard drive all show up perfectly fine, then it might be the other cable that was having a problem. So there might be a problem on the cable end. Okay. All right. So in the next segment, I'm gonna get on the screen recorder and show you how to look further into, you know, whether your hard drives are connecting or not. And so one thing, by the way, is that a lot of my cards, especially the internal ones, I always put the BIOS ROM on the card. And I know a lot of people will say, hey, you know, you should erase that and save yourself 10 seconds during boot up or something like that. And that's true. You do save yourself a few seconds during boot up. But in a lot of cases, you know, if you're not rebooting your server every day, or, you know, a couple of times a day, I don't know what people are doing, okay? But if you are rebooting it a lot, then yeah, I can see why you want to save those 10 seconds during boot up, okay? But if you're only booting up like once, you know, a week or something like that, and you just kind of leave it running all the time, then I actually recommend that you leave the BIOS ROM program on this. And the reason for that is that it provides you a pre-boot environment for troubleshooting problems. And it really kind of can save you a lot of time when you're actually troubleshooting a problem. So whatever time you save, you know, the 10 seconds that you save during boot up, you know, is almost negated if you have to spend a lot of time troubleshooting problems when there's a problem, right? And so, you know, there's kind of pros and cons to that, right? So, you know, if you really are rebooting your box a lot, then, you know, and, you know, you really, the 10 seconds during boot up really matters to you, sure, go ahead and remove the BIOS ROM. But otherwise, I really recommend that you leave it on, because they can be very useful tool to have when you're troubleshooting problems with your HBA and your hard drives and all these connections, even before you boot up into an operating system. Okay, so anyway, all right, let's go to the next segment, and I'll show you how to troubleshoot or kind of look at the hard drive connections using the BIOS ROM program, and then also how to do it in the operating systems. Okay, all right. All right, guys, so here is the machine booting up, and this is the Avago BIOS ROM loading during post. Now at some point it's going to prompt me to press a key sequence, which I believe is Control-C, to get into the program where you can kind of change configuration settings and stuff like that. So I'm going to make sure to do that when I'm prompted to do that. Okay, so there it prompted me with the Control-C, and you can see now it says please wait, invoking SAS Configuration Utility. Okay, so this is the LSI SAS Configuration Utility that is in the BIOS ROM. So you can see immediately it shows both HBAs that I have. And so the 9201-8i is just the LSI 9201. The 9211-8i is the Dell H310 that's flashed with the 9211 firmware. So if you enter any of these, so you highlight the controller that you're interested in, press enter, and then you'll get into this menu. And so the important part here is to go to the SAS topology. And here I can also select direct attached devices, and you will see a list of the hard drives that are connected. And it's not immediately obvious, but over here on the it also refreshes every few seconds too, so don't mind that it kind of blinks out for a little bit. But on the right side here, a column that says device info controller, SATA. So it tells you whether it's a SATA or SAS device. But if you press the arrow key to the right, you will get, here, let's see, hold on. Wait a second. Oh yeah, here we go. So you can also look at the maximum link speed, which here is 6 gigabit. You can see the negotiated link speed, which is 3 gigabit per second, because these are relatively old hard drives I have in my test rig. And so you can see additional information about the drives that are connected by kind of scrolling to the right here. Okay, so this page is very useful to see if your hard drives are actually connecting or not. Right, so earlier I said, you know, test out the cables by swapping them to see if the problem follows the cable. Well, you could have your computer open to this screen, and as you can see, it refreshes every few seconds. And as you unplug or plug cables, you'll see the hard drives fall out or connect back to the controller. So this is a very useful utility in order to troubleshoot your hardware before you even boot a operating system. Right, and the reason why I like to do that is because sometimes you might be having a problem with the operating system driver, and you know, so in that case you're going to be compounding both the possibility of a hardware problem and a software problem, and then you know it might take a little bit longer to diagnose. But in this case, since I haven't even booted an operating system, I'm looking purely just at the hardware. I'm not looking at, you know, if I don't see the hard drives connecting at this point, I'm pretty sure there's some sort of hardware problem. It could be a hard drive, it could be a cable, it could be the port on the HBA. You know, it could be one of those things, but it's definitely not an operating system driver issue, right? So by looking at it this way, you're kind of isolating how you're looking at the problem. Whereas if you're in the operating system, you know, a hardware problem might not look so different versus a driver problem. And so it'll be a little bit harder to distinguish. So anyway, yeah, so this is a very useful utility for kind of looking to see if your hard drives are properly connecting or not. Now, if you go through the controllers and you see your hard drives connecting here, and so obviously that means your cable's okay, your HBA card's okay, and you see it connected here, then more than likely, and if you're still having problems, you know, when you fully boot up in whatever operating system you're using and your hard drives are still not showing up, you know, more than likely it is not going to be a hardware problem. There's probably some other problem. Could be a operating system driver, it could be a file system problem, it could be, you know, many other things higher up in the technology stack, but it's more than likely not going to be a hardware problem. All right, so I'll just also show you that you can get out of this by hitting escape, and then you can go to the other controller, and we'll also verify there in the SAS topology that we see all 8 hard drives. So yep, I see the 8 hard drives I have on that controller as well. So in this case, I've confirmed that my hardware is working. I see all 8 hard drives on both controllers, so a total of 16 hard drives, and everything is fine. And so this confirms that I don't have a hardware problem at this point. And if I were to have some other problem when I boot up, you know, I should probably focus my attention on potentially a software problem, a driver problem, or something else that's not a hardware issue. Okay, so let me get out of this. And we're going to go ahead and boot up into an operating system. And I will first boot up in Linux and show you how to look at your hard drives, and to make sure that your hard drives are connected in Linux. And then I will also do something similar with the in FreeNAS, and so that way you'll kind of get to see both. Okay, so here I am. I'm booted up into the server with a Linux operating system, and so the first thing you want to do is just to see if your HBA control cards are there. And one of the quick ways to do that is the lspci command. So I'll run lspci, and I'll grep for LSI because I know my controllers use the LSI driver. And so there you can see I have both SAS 2008 HBA cards listed, and so that tells me that the cards are seen you know, in the operating system. So, and then the next thing you can do if you want to see if the drivers are loading correctly is you can specify one of these cards with a PCI address, and I'll do -VV, and you'll be able to see. Let's scroll down here. So you'll see here kernel driver at the very bottom, kernel driver in use MPT2 SAS. Right. So this means that the operating system saw the card, recognized which driver to use, and loaded this MPT2 SAS driver. All right. And so if you get this far, then you know your operating system sees the HBA card, and it knows what driver, it was able to identify which driver to load. And if you want to see if maybe perhaps it loaded the right driver, but there might have been some problems, you can go through the kernel messages and grep for this driver. So I usually just grep for MPT. And here, let me scroll back up. And if we look at that, so here you'll see messages from that driver. You'll see two instances of the driver, the CM0, which is one card, and then CM1 is the second card. And you can see that they both end with port enable success. So that's usually a good indicator. If there was if the driver was detecting some issue with the card, you would normally see some error messages here. So if you don't see any error messages here, and it looks like the port enable success message shows up, then pretty much your hardware, so far, we verified the hardware works. This means the operating system driver is working, so long as you're not seeing any errors here. And so then the next thing is, let's see if the operating system sees the hard drives. And so the command to do that is ls-scsi. And so here you can see that I have all 16 hard drives. Here's the first 8. There's a Western Digital followed by 7 Maxters. And then in the second controller, I have 8 Maxter drives. And so all my drives are showing up here. Okay, so if you don't see your hard drive here, and then if you saw error messages with the driver, then it's still possible that there might be a hardware problem, maybe the firmware problem, perhaps that the firmware is not talking correctly with the driver, and so that will isolate your problem down to that. But if you see the drivers loading and everything seems to be fine, but your hard drives are not showing, in ls-scsi, then more than likely you have a hard drive problem. Okay, and so anyway, so now I can see that my hard drives are there. That means the SCSI layer on top of the hardware driver is working, and I see the hard drives. And so the next thing you might want to do is, let's say in my case, I have a Z pool on these drives, so I will try to import that Z pool. So now we're kind of getting into the file system layer of the technology stack. Okay, so now I have the Z pool imported. Let's check on the status of the pool. Okay, so everything looks like it's fine. And if we had any concerns about the integrity of the pool, we can always run a scrub on this pool and then look at the status again. And let me kind of scroll down here so you can see. So the scrub, there's no data on this pool, so the scrub went really quick, but basically it said there were no errors with the data, which there was none anyway. But anyway, so this is how you kind of work up the technology stack, from looking at the hardware, looking at the cabling, looking at the hard drives, making sure the hard drives are connecting by looking in the LSI BIOS ROM program, the SAS Configuration Utility, and then getting into your operating system to make sure the driver is working, make sure that the SCSI layer with all the hard drives are working, to make sure that your Z pool is working. Okay, and so if you were having a problem somewhere along the line of what we just went over, you would you would basically be able to identify where the problem was, and hopefully be able to isolate it down to where you need to really focus your attention on troubleshooting the problem. All right, so I'm going to do something similar in FreeBSD, in FreeNAS, which is based on FreeBSD. And so I'm going to reboot this machine with a FreeNAS bootable USB drive and kind of repeat some of these steps in the case of FreeNAS. All right. Hi guys. Okay, so here I am. I'm logged in via SSH to my FreeNAS machine. This is the same server that I previously had the Linux booted up on. So you can gain a shell either through directly at the console with the keyboard and monitor by pressing, I think, like option 9 or something like that. You could also get a shell within the FreeNAS GUI. But unfortunately, I'm having some problems here. So in case someone here might know what's causing this, but when I try to go to the FreeNAS UI, I get this connection to NAS, make sure NAS system is powered on and connected to the network. And obviously, if I'm logged in via SSH, it's on. But yeah, for whatever reason, this isn't working right now. I'm not really sure why. So I just turned on SSH, and I'm going to show you what I wanted to show you through this SSH terminal. Okay, so we verified that the hardware works. We verified that the hard drives are connected, and we can see it in the LSI SAS Configuration Utility in the BIOS ROM, right? And so now we're booted up into FreeNAS. And so one of the first things you want to do, very similar to the Linux example, we can do lspci, grep for LSI. And here again, we see the two LSI SAS controllers, the SAS 2008 HBAs. So they're there, and the driver in FreeBSD for these controllers is MPS. And so if you want to see if the driver is reporting any errors, you can run dmessage and just grep for MPS. And well, let me pipe that into more so we can kind of take a closer look at it. So here you'll see MPS 0, Avago Technologies. It's detecting the device and the firmware, the driver version that it's using. Here's the second MPS 1, which is the second controller, and basically the same type of messages. And you're also seeing the various devices that it's detected that's connected to those controllers. So MPS 0 found these SAS addresses for the devices that are connected to it, and then MPS 1 likewise found other devices connected to it as well. And so if the driver were to report any errors, you would see it in this output somewhere. Okay, so that's how you verify that in FreeNAS at least, that the controller is working and the driver is working with it properly. Now, if you just want to see the connected storage devices, there's a different command. In Linux, it was lscsi. In FreeBSD, you have to use the cam subsystem. And so you can run cam control dev list. And then let me clear the screen here. So here you'll be able to see all the hard drives that are connected to it, and what the device name is, so DA0 through DA16 here. And so this confirms that I have all 16 drives connected and just fine, and the operating system can see the hard drives. Okay, so now beyond that, you can run the usual zpool commands. So run zpool status right now. You're not really going to see anything other than the boot drive, and that's because the zpool on these drives was created with ZFS on Linux, and so it doesn't import automatically. But I believe I can import it. I think I just have to set an option. I think maybe it's like read only on. Data. So yeah, let me just, I think the pool is called data. So let's see if I can import it this way. Okay, I'll force it. That's fine. Okay, so it looks like it imported. Let's check it out. Zpool status. Okay, so you can see here that because this pool was created with ZFS on Linux, it has a slightly different feature set and all that. So it's not going to import cleanly, but you can see that it did import all the 16 drives from 0, 3, 4, 5, 6, and I think 7. One of these is probably 7, 8, 9. One of these is probably 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Right? So 0 through 15, that's the 16 drives that are part of that pool. So this verifies that the hard drives are working and on the Z pool, obviously this is not a normal FreeNAS Z pool. So I'm going to go ahead and export that again and get it out of here. Okay. All right. So there you have it. Those are the steps that I would recommend if you're having problems with a HBA you just got, you installed it, and your hard drives are not showing up, or you're not seeing your Z pool, or whatever it is. Start with the hardware. Go through the troubleshooting steps I kind of went through earlier. Look for the heartbeat. Make sure your cables are working. Use the cable swapping technique I had mentioned if you need to isolate it down to a particular cable that might be having problems. And then once you've verified, and if you have the BIOS ROM SAS Configuration Utility, use that. Make use of that, and see if you can see your hard drives in there before you even boot any operating system. That way you can isolate any potential operating system related problems from a hardware problem. And so once you've confirmed that your hardware is working, boot up in your operating system, and I just showed you how you can look at the driver and the hardware using LSPCI, and then looking at the kernel messages to see that the driver isn't reporting any errors. And then once you've confirmed that that's all good, then you can look with either LSCSI or the cam control devlist command to see that your storage devices are in fact showing up in the operating system. Of course, if you're using ZFS, you can then import the pool with the zpool command to just make sure that everything is showing up correctly. Okay, so hopefully you guys will find that helpful for anybody who is having some problems with their HBA. If you follow those steps along the way, you'll probably be able to identify exactly where you're having problems, and then you can focus on whether you need to replace the HBA card or the cable, or maybe you actually ended up with a hard drive that was failing or whatnot. So I'd like to look at things kind of at a low level. I like to peel back the onion, so to speak, and not kind of confine myself just to a UI, because between the UI and the hardware there are many layers, as you just saw. And so if you try to troubleshoot from the UI perspective, you could go down a whole bunch of different paths. And so I like to kind of peel the onion back and just kind of look at it from a low level and work my way up and make sure that everything, the foundational layers underneath are working correctly, and just kind of work my way up until I find where the problem is. Okay, so all right, hopefully that you guys find that helpful, and if you like this video, make sure to hit the like button for me, and if you'd like to see more videos from me, make sure to subscribe. All right, thank you very much, guys. Have a good day. Bye-bye.